All right, it's 12 o'clock on Wednesday. It's time for the Iowa Learning Farms Conservation webinar. Happy New Year and welcome to the 2026 Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Webinar Series. Really excited to have the webinar series still going in 2026, and I think we have some great speakers lined up. And I am Matt Helmers with ISU and ISU Extension and Outreach and Director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. We have with us today Rachel Drobnak. Rachel is a PhD candidate at Michigan State University in the Department of Crop and Soil Sciences. She said before we got on that she finished her comprehensive prelim exam last semester, so that is always a rite of passage for PhD students. So congratulations on that, Rachel. And we have one of our favorite topics on the Iowa Learning Farms webinar series, prairie strips. And so we're going to hear about managing prairie strips to improve soil health and farm profitability. As always, if you have questions, please type those into the chat box and we'll get those to Rachel at the end of the talk. And with that, Rachel, the virtual floor is all yours.
All right, thank you so much, Matt. And I'm really excited to be here today, sharing some of my work out of Michigan State University. If you've been on the series before, I've seen there's been a good amount of prairie strip talks. I'm excited to see that. I hope that I can bring a new perspective today, sharing some research on soil health and also how prairie strips might fit into your farm's profitability and bottom line. All right. So just briefly, to touch on a little bit about my background, I'm currently a third-year PhD candidate at Michigan State University. I work in the Soil Health and Ecosystem Ecology Lab, and all of my research is centered around asking how conservation practices on farms can alter soil health and also work for farm economics. I really like blending the two because I think both are important to get them adopted. And in the past and currently, I've worked for MSU Extension and on a couple of farms around the state. And just to briefly touch on the lab I work in, Christine Sprunger is our lead PI. She's given a webinar last year on nematodes, if you came to that one. Our lab's based out of the W.K. Kellogg Biological Station, which is located in Southwest Michigan. And our whole focus of the lab is to evaluate soil health in the Midwest and in Michigan. We view soil health as the continued capacity of soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. And the way we go about assessing soil health really is focused on the biological, physical, and chemical components of the soil. Our lab specializes in identifying free-living nematodes, which is a whole community of organisms in the soil that can tell us a lot about soil health. Today, I'm going to be focusing more on the chemical portion of the soil, talking about soil carbon and nitrogen, soil organic matter. But just to say, all of these three components are important to measure and relate to each other and are some of our interests in the lab. And on the bottom right here, I just show a few of the counties we've sampled in. We do a lot of on-farm surveying, a lot of on-farm projects with farmer collaborators, and also have many projects at experimental sites. The reason why I love studying prairie strips is I believe they're one of like the best conservation practices you can put on your farm, because they fulfill all of the principles of conservation agriculture, which are to minimize soil disturbance, to increase plant diversification, and to create permanent soil cover on the landscape. Many other conservation practices, such as tillage, no tillage, or cover crops, achieve one or two of these principles really well, but prairie strips cover all three, and thus have, in my opinion, the best potential to improve soil health. By definition, prairie strips are when you convert portions of agricultural land into native perennial vegetation. This could be within a landscape, as you see here, along a telephone pole line or on the, around the borders of a farm. Typically, we recommend they take up at least 10% of your field and they be at least 30 feet wide. And if you are familiar with Iowa State University's STRIPS project, they really spearheaded a lot of research about prairie strips and continue to be really active in that area. We have started a sister project in Michigan called My Strips or Michigan Prairie Strips, where we try to promote the use of prairie strips in Michigan, conduct research in our state, and also see how they might fit in uniquely to the needs of our state. For example, orchard growers are really interested in prairie strips here. And I just wanted to highlight, if you're not aware, a few technical assistance and incentive programs that are available if you want to install prairie strips on your land. One of them is the Conservation Reserve Program's CP43 designation. That's for prairie strips. It's supported in Iowa and Michigan. If you're in Michigan, our MyStrips program can financially cover some of the cost of purchasing seed. And then there's lots of other nonprofits out there like Pheasants Forever, which can provide some sources for seed. So beyond it just being a great agricultural conservation practice, I wanted to highlight some of the ways that prairie strips provide multiple ecosystem services on the landscape. So we've seen in Michigan that after 2 years of having a prairie strip, butterfly abundance was higher, spider abundance was higher, and the cropland received greater pollination services. In Iowa, older prairie strips were found to have increased microbial biomass below ground in the soil, both in terms of carbon and nitrogen. And what this means is there are more microbes living in the soil under prairie strips and provide more inputs to increase soil organic matter, both in terms of carbon and nitrogen. Even though this is great and we love to see research on prairie strip soils, we still know little about the below ground services that prairie strips can provide, especially when it comes to soil carbon. We've done some initial work here in Michigan on our youngest strips, 1 to 3 years old after installing, and we found that they really had variable increases in soil carbon, and this depended on a lot of different factors. So this has really inspired the research I'll be sharing today, which tries to build on this and see, when can farmers expect to see changes in soil organic matter and soil carbon in their soils when they have prairie strips? The reason why I focus on soil carbon is because it's really critical for improving agroecosystems. Soils account for one of the largest global carbon pools. That means if you take all the carbon in the world and portion it out into its location or source, by and large, most of it comes from the soil. That's more than all the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and all the carbon that makes up life on Earth. We've done a great job getting rid of a lot of the carbon in the soil. You can see here in the map below, this is of the Eastern Corn Belt. All of the red shaded areas are where soil carbon has been lost just due to agriculture alone. And this is true of Iowa as well. On average, I think this is about 50% of the original soil carbon. And what this means is that we've lost a lot of the really important ecosystem services that soils can provide, not only in mitigating carbon dioxide loss into the atmosphere, but also the less soil carbon we have in the soil, the less good of a job our soil can do to grow food for us. And that can mean we have soil erosion, worse water holding capacity, etc. So soil carbon is really important for a lot of the things we need to grow food well. When we're interested in measuring soil carbon and seeing if prairie strips can improve soil carbon, we'd love to do that, but the issue is carbon accrual takes decades to detect. So this image below highlights the same experimental site I'm going to show data from in a little bit, but a different project where a scientist studied the soil carbon change after 25 years in a conventionally managed agricultural system, and then did the same thing with an early successional system, which means it was colonized by native grasses, forbs, and remained undisturbed for 25 years, similar to a prairie strip. After 25 years, there was no change in soil carbon in our conventional system, but there was an increase in soil carbon in our early successional system. So this gives me hope and really confirms for me that prairie strips can build soil carbon. However, I don't have 25 years to measure those changes, and it's really hard to do so. So my concept for trying to measure how carbon may accrue in prairie strips in the short term is to really focus on sensitive indicators that can change more rapidly than just measuring soil carbon overall. And what I mean by that is depicted here in this graph. You can see on the y-axis we have total soil organic matter, which includes soil carbon, And after we cultivate land, a lot of soil organic matter is lost. And then when we implement a management change, such as prairie strips that might build soil carbon, soil organic matter might increase over time at a slower rate. But it does so more quickly in our lightest gray box, which is our active soil organic matter pool. Our active soil organic matter pool is part of soil organic matter that is processed more rapidly in the soil and can be detected more easily through sensitive indicators. So there are some available in soil health labs we can use to measure rapid changes in soil carbon and to pull out those maybe most soon to increase measurements of soil carbon. I call them sensitive indicators, and the three I'm going to be really talking about today are soil protein, which is a portion of soil organic matter that's nitrogen heavy. And soil protein is really important for providing a source of organic nitrates to plants and animals as nutrition. Permanganate oxidizable carbon is another one, and this is a measurement of a portion of soil organic carbon that can detect early carbon sequestration in the soil. Finally, our most sensitive indicator of the three, I would say, is mineralizable carbon. This is a measurement of microbial respiration or microbes breathing, just like we do, carbon dioxide. So this is a measurement of carbon dioxide in the soil that is sourced from microbes, and both tells us that there are potentially microbes and the food source available to them so that they can process and respire. All right, so today I'm going to use that concept of our short-term indicators to try to answer a couple of questions. The first is, do prairie strips increase soil carbon indicators compared to adjacent cropland? For this, I'm going to be looking at those a bit more established prairie strips, 3 to 5 years old, to see if after 3 to 5 years of having a prairie strip, we can detect changes in soil carbon. Then I'm going to use the same experiment to ask if the cropland management influences soil carbon gains under prairie strips. So by this I mean, does it matter how you're managing your land before you have a prairie strip to influence how much you might gain in soil carbon? And then finally, I'm going to talk more about the financial side of prairie strips and provide some resources to see if prairie strips are a cost-effective conservation practice. So to start with my first question, I conducted research at the Kellogg Biological Station where I work in Southwest Michigan, our long-term ecosystem research experiment, which is shown on the left here. This is a long-term field trial that's been running for over 30 years, and I use the two cropping systems in green and blue that have a prairie strip, and that prairie strip goes down the center of each plot. These two cropping systems have been managed in contrasting ways for over 30 years. The blue treatment I call biologically based, and the green I call chemical input. The main difference between these two is that my blue or biologically based treatment has never received an input of nutrients or pesticides through fertilizer, compost, or any other means. My chemical input, on the other hand, has received a certain amount of inorganic nitrogen, inorganic fertilizer, and pesticides. Both of them have gone under a corn, soybean, wheat rotation with a red clover cover crop for the entire time. For the soil sampling experiment, we sampled for 3 years out in this experiment at monthly time points throughout the growing season, from 2022 to 2024. And we sampled prairie strips as they went from the 3rd year of their establishment to the 5th year. And by doing this really intensive sampling, we get a lot of data on soil health that might not otherwise come out if we only sampled 1 month of each season or only 1 or 2 years. If you were to go out to this experiment and look at the plots, it'd look kind of like this. We sampled at 4 different locations in each plot. We sampled in the center of the prairie strip, shown in green, and then we sampled 3 different distances into the crop at 1 meter, 5 meters, and 20 meters. And for some of the results I'll be showing, I'm grouping all of my cropland treatments into just crop, as they didn't end up being significantly different from one another. Once we collected soil, we took that soil back to the lab, processed it, and then ran our 3 different assays. Okay, so going back to my question, do prairie strips increase soil carbon? We found that it was inconsistent the first 3 years of prairie strip establishment, so what about 3 to 5 years? What we found with soil protein and POC that prairie strips did increase soil carbon slightly. This was a significant result, and the increase was about 4% compared to all of the cropland distances. However, interestingly, our mineralizable carbon measurement had the most strong response. So prairie strip mineralizable carbon compared to the cropland increased by 46%, which is really exciting. And what this shows to me is that mineralizable carbon really does act as a super sensitive indicator and reflects the fact that prairie strips have actively growing roots, actively growing and actively available rhizosphere habitat and space for more microbes and animals to help process soil carbon and provide more inputs into the soil. So this is exciting to see. Another exciting thing that came out of some of my work is that I took this same experimental design and then sampled on farm sites around Michigan, working farms around Michigan that had established prairie strips. And I wanted to see if the trends I was seeing here remain true when I go out on farm and take samples that might have been done on farms with very different conditions. And what I found was that the benefits to soil carbon that I found at the experimental site are similar to my on-farm sites. So here I have the same setup of the graphs, but all of this data is now coming from working farms around Michigan. You can see again that with poxy and protein, there's a slight increase. It's less than the experimental site, but again, this includes a lot more variability. And then with mineralizable carbon, I'm seeing a much stronger signal of an increase in the prairie strips. So this is really exciting to see and confirms to me that our experimental site is reflective of working farm conditions. And also we can track these changes a little bit more in detail at our experimental site. Just to give you a sense of where those soils were collected on farms, as I said, we sampled all over the state of Michigan. This is mostly the southern portion of the Lower Peninsula. We also included a few grass buffer strips, which are less diverse than prairie strips, but functionally can do similar jobs to the soil. We have sampled a more diverse range of soil textures and also sampled farms of many different shapes and sizes with different crops, climatic factors, and agronomic intensity. All right, so now to go to our second question, does it matter how we manage our fields to see changes in soil carbon under prairie strips? To answer this question, I want to highlight again the fact that we sampled two different cropping systems that had been managed differently for over 30 years. So our biologically based system, which received no nutrient or pesticide inputs, and then our chemical system, which receives a amount of inorganic fertilizer and pesticides. I will say the chemical input system receives about a third less nitrogen than a conventionally managed agricultural system, but some nitrogen nonetheless. So, if it matters how intensely you manage your cropland, I would expect that a biologically based system might have higher levels of soil carbon than a chemical input system. And maybe having prairie strips would benefit, but benefit less a system that's already doing pretty well in terms of soil carbon. So if that were the case, I would expect to see a result like this, and I've kind of doodled out this figure here, where for my blue system that's never received chemical inputs or fertilizer, there's not as much of a gain in having prairie strips. There's a slight gain, but not as much as a chemical system, which starts from a lower level of soil carbon, but builds it to the same level, but that gain is higher relatively. If this relationship weren't true, if it doesn't really matter how you manage your field, we see the same soil carbon gain, I would expect to see a result like this, where these two lines are pretty similar. All right, so on this slide, I'm going to show you exactly what I found, and the setup's going to be the same. So for soil protein, what I found is that all of my cropland distances for my chemical input system that are in green were lower compared to my no input system, that biologically based system. And I found the exact thing that I predicted, which is soil carbon gains were similar for both under prairie strips. However, they were greater for my chemical input system relative to the no input system. This trend was the same for POC, where the gains in soil carbon in terms of POC were greater for a system that was more intensively managed, that green line, than a system that was received no inputs of nitrogen or pesticides. With my mineralizable carbon, the second prediction I had was true. It didn't matter as much the cropping system that it came from. The gain in mineralizable carbon was about the same for both treatments, about 55%. And what this kind of tells me and how I interpret this is that soils with a legacy of intensive management, that more green system, experience greater soil carbon gains under prairie strips. So if you install prairie strips in land that might be more degraded or marginal, you might expect to see greater gains in soil carbon than if you put the same prairie strip in a part of your field that already had pretty productive or pretty healthy levels of soil carbon. All right, just to wrap up and summarize some of what I've been saying is that prairie strips, after 3 to 5 years, we're finding do have slight increases in soil carbon indicators. And this is interesting because we also say from a management perspective that above ground, it takes about that much time, 3 to 5 years, to start to see an established prairie strip in terms of the plant communities that we're seeing above ground. We're also finding that working farms in Michigan had a similar trend, similar increase in soil carbon as the experimental site. And cropping systems that are more intense or maybe contain more chemical inputs often had lower carbon levels in the cropland, leading to greater gains in prairie strips. In the future, I'm continuing this work to disentangle drivers of what might be driving these changes in my sensitive carbon indicators. All right, just with the last few minutes here, I'm going to touch on when prairie strips might be a cost-effective conservation practice. So zooming back out from the soil health side of prairie strips, as an agricultural outreach specialist or budding one, I'm really interested in knowing when and why farmers would decide to put in a prairie strip. I'm well aware that there are a lot of barriers that might stop somebody from installing them because you're removing land from production. Prairie strips are not going to directly improve crop productivity, and prairie strips require an investment in time and money to install. We also ask that prairie strips stay in place for a long amount of time, 10, 20 plus years. So it's a lot to ask. And while the benefits to prairie strips might be convincing enough, decrease groundwater pollution, increase wildlife habitat, and now I'm adding to the literature by exploring how they improve soil health, it's still a lot to consider. And the one way that I like to justify or approach installing prairie strips is to take advantage of the land you have and to explore ways that you could more efficiently utilize productive cropland. So what I mean by that is if you have a map of your field of, for example, yield stability or average yields across your field spatially, you might know or even anecdotally know areas of your field that are consistently under-yielding, underproductive, flooded, hilly, sloped, etc. So this is an example field. Those red areas are consistently under-yielding areas. They are borders of our field. In Michigan, it's often because we have a forest bordering a field. It just makes that cropland less productive. And if we consider only putting prairie strips in our unproductive areas, which might take up 10% of the field to begin with, we might find that producing crops in that under yielding portion of the field actually costs more for us than converting it to prairie. And that might be because our crop inputs remain the same no matter what yield we're getting, but we might just not be yielding enough in those specific areas to produce a profit, even though the whole field might be profiting. And so I took this approach and wanted to explore at what point are prairie strips going to cost less and actually make money than continuing to farm portions of your field. So I designed a kind of like a really simple calculator to come up with this answer. On average, I plotted my result here. So you can see in this graph, going from the left to right x-axis, we have increasing to decreasing yields. And I have plotted this as the percent of the Michigan statewide average yield. So we've got 100% of the average statewide yield all the way to 0. And on the y-axis, I have how much you would profit by converting to prairie. So this is taking into account not only how much you would be saving by not producing a crop in that area, but also incentive program costs, maintenance costs, all of the costs of having a prairie. Okay, so if you just look at that blue line, you can see that it goes from negative to positive once you cross 56% of the Michigan statewide average yield. So anything less than that, you would start to be making money off of converting to a prairie strip. And then if you include CRP incentives, or what we estimate to be a CRP incentive payment, that break-even point goes all the way up to 80%, where if you're yielding any less than 80% of the statewide average yield, you'd be making money by converting to a prairie. And you might be wondering, okay, but what are actually all of these yields? And I've kind of shown them here below. This is for Michigan. So Iowa would be slightly different, but you can see for corn, soybean, and wheat, what the yields are for those break-even points. And you might still be looking at it and going, okay, but those are really, really low yields. I would never yield anything like that. But I want you to consider the consistently under yielding portions of your field. They might be a small area of your field, but if it's crossing that point, it actually might be saving you money by putting in a prairie strip. And this is averaged. We've made a lot of guesses to try to come up with a general consensus on what this break-even point is. But if you're interested in coming up with your own break-even point and seeing how this would play out on your own farm, I've created a MSU Extension bulletin called Budgeting for Prairie Strips that's available for free online. The QR code here, you could download it. You can also email me. I can send you the link. It comes with both a budget, which is an Excel spreadsheet. You can adjust any of the values to your own operation, and also a PDF to explain how to use it. This calculates prairie costs for over 15 years, and you can include CRP payments or not. And it's designed for Michigan row crops, but it can easily be adjusted for Iowa by just adjusting for prices and inputs, et cetera, or for other crops if you're not growing corn, soybeans, or wheat. All right, and with that, I have a lot of people to thank for supporting my research, both in terms of time, energy, and money. And I'm really happy to take questions. And if you'd like to get in contact with me, I have my email below. Thank you so much.
Oh, awesome, Rachel. What a way to start off 2026. That is great. Uh, okay, let's go to those logistical sides, and we definitely
Mhm.
have some questions. Just want to acknowledge the key partners that are so helpful in bringing us the conservation webinar series: the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, and the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture. So thank you to all of those for their support to make the conservation webinar series possible. Let's go to the next. Okay, if you need a 2026 get started on the right note to earn a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today. Include your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Again, ALENAW at iastate.edu. Okay, next slide. If you watch this webinar live and are willing to fill out a voluntary demographic survey, we'd greatly appreciate it. You can scan that QR code or go to iowalearningfarms.org/survey. Only one survey response is needed for all 2026 webinars. So if you do it today, you don't have to do it any other time throughout the year. So if you're willing to do that, we'd greatly appreciate that. And next slide. Okay. Um, Dr. Artie Singh will be with us next week. Pest ID and beyond, harnessing AI applications to support resilient crops and healthy ecosystems. So please tune in next week for that one if you have interest, or let somebody you know that might have interest know about that. We will be here every Wednesday at noon Central Time. And I think the next slide is just highlighting that there was a question. This and all webinars are archived as long as all the recordings work, and are available on the iowalearningfarms.org /webinar site, or you can go to YouTube. There's an Iowa Learning Farms webinars page there. Okay, we do have a few questions, and we're going to start with, if your biological system had more tillage, what do you think is the mechanism for that system to have more soil carbon?
Great question. Yeah, both systems that I showed have cover crops as well. And then the biological system, I think I showed has slightly more tillage passes to control weeds. Since we're not applying any pesticides, there's slightly more weed pressure. I've asked that question to scientists here at the LTER, and what they've come up with is the cover crop has provided a really important input of organic matter to the system. And while both have the cover crop, I think that has largely helped the biologically based system have slightly higher levels of soil carbon. It's an interesting question, though. I mean, potentially higher weed pressure in the biologically based system as well could increase the amount of organic matter going in the system. And then the last thing I'll say is those chemical inputs of nitrogen and pesticides. If you're applying any sort of pesticide, it might harm our microbial community under the soil, especially if it's a fungicide. So by doing so, we're kind of taking out all of the good actors in our soil that can process organic matter and build soil carbon in the long term. So that's something that we don't have in the biologically based system. So it might actually aid our microbial communities versus the chemical input system.
Okay. Elena reminded me or alerted me there's one more slide
Oh,
here and I
I'm
want
so
to get
sorry.
to before we move too much
Here you go.
further, which is if you tune into any webinars in 2025, you will soon receive an email from Iowa Learning Farms. Actually, you'll receive it today from Iowa Learning Farms to complete your year-end survey. It's voluntary and confidential. We estimate it'll take 5 minutes of your time. We would greatly appreciate it if you're willing to fill that out. Thank you so very much. Again, shouldn't take much of your time. And one more thing to do today, but you will get it today. All right. Um, One person was curious about your soil organic carbon results at different depths, and specifically the
Hmm.
30 to 100 centimeter depth.
Yeah, I took soil samples from 0 to 10 centimeters. That's about 4 inches deep. I did not go any deeper.
Okay.
There's a publication, Cordova et al. 2025, who does do full 0 to 100 meter soil organic carbon measurements for those treatments I highlighted. I looked back on that for this presentation thinking that they might be that different, but actually they're not super different between the two systems. Um, it wasn't significantly different, I think, at any depth between my biologically based and chemical input system for, I'm talking about soil organic carbon
Okay.
stocks. Yeah.
Okay. Um, this one, do you have any resources for prairie strips applied to orchards?
Mm. Yeah, great question. If you want to email me, I can send you a trifold, a couple handouts I've made for outreach presentations specifically for orchards. And then my strips, our coordinator, she works with a lot of orchard growers to figure out best places to install and how to manage. Rufus Isaacs is also a professor at MSU who does a lot of work on blueberry farms and wildlife patches similar to prairie strips. So I'd recommend looking into his research and some of his materials.
Okay. Um, okay. Oh, can you, this person, you go back to your contact information. Let's go
Oh,
back to that
here,
slide. They
let me
wanted
put
your
that in
email
the,
again. Yep.
yeah, let me put that in the, here it is. And I'll type it
Cool.
in here too.
Okay. Great. Um, this might be outside, but is it helpful for fire burn to burn the prairie to get rid of weed seeds?
Mm. I don't know. I know we have a plant seed ecologist, Lauren Sullivan here, who's doing some research recently on prairie strips, weed movement, and seed dispersal. So there's no results quite yet, but I will ask her that question. I imagine that fire helps control. Fire is really important for prairies, and we use it as management in prairie strips as well. So it could help to control some weedier species, but I'm not quite sure about the ecology of that.
Um, somebody asked about the potential impacts of not having livestock grazing, um, eh,
Hmm.
integrate livestock integrated into the prairie strips. And I don't know if there's any work that's looked at carbon changes in prairie strips where there's livestock integration, but they asked that question about livestock integration with prairie strips, and because they've seen some um, in, greater increases of soil carbon in areas where they have rotationally grazed land.
Yeah. We don't have the experimental setup here,
Oh,
as far as I know, with prairie strips. It's a
okay.
great question. I'm just reading it as well. We wonder
Yeah.
about the lack of livestock integration causing limits for increases in carbon. And sounded like aggregate stability increase, but not soil carbon. Yeah, it gets really tricky. I mean, even though I'm seeing some really nice trends and increases in these early carbon indicators, like I said, these are the most sensitive. So while they could change really rapidly, they might not also be the most predictive of these long-term changes in total carbon, which is something I haven't measured yet. So yeah, it could be quite different when you add in livestock.
Okay. I guess what kind of interest are you getting in prairie strips in Michigan?
Yeah, great question. We're
Yeah.
getting a lot of interest. I think we initially imagined, I'm speaking for the whole MyStrips
Yeah.
team, that it would stay within row crop producers, but actually a lot of interest has come from smaller producers.
Okay.
Michigan has a nice diversity of really large conventional farms similar to Iowa, and then small vegetable growers and a lot of orchards, especially on the west side of the state. For our orchard growers and some of our vegetable producers, there might already be areas they're not growing in because orchards are often
Yeah.
sloped. They can't put trees on the lower portions of the orchard because it gets too cold. So
Yeah.
they might just have really nice opportunities to put prairie strips in that also would benefit their crops because they rely so much on pollinators.
Yeah.
I would say that's been a huge portion of our interest, but a lot of row crop producers are finding prairie strips work nicely around borders, low-lying areas, forest edges,
Great.
etc.
Cool. Um, Somebody asked about have there been any issues with pesticide drift affecting stands or establishments?
hmm I I haven't heard of any, and I'm assuming maybe you're talking about herbicides affecting
Yep.
stands or establishment. Um, I don't have great knowledge on best management practices for putting in prairie strips. I do know we've had some work done recently from a master's student, Annabelle McCarthy, trying to see if pesticides, in particular insecticides, have negative
Yep.
effects for pollinators, and we did not
Yep.
see harmful effects of pesticide drift getting into prairie strips and then causing issues with butterfly and
Yeah.
pollinator fatality or
Yep.
fecundity.
Yep. Uh, Here's one. I guess in Iowa we are seeing. I think there are some beekeepers finding the prairie
Mm.
strips beneficial. But are you seeing any beekeepers finding strips beneficial for honey production?
I don't know of any
Okay.
beekeepers having prairie strips. I'm sure there are. I mean, I think what's been most interesting going out to some farms and seeing that whether or not you're calling it prairie strips or pollinator habitat,
Yeah.
a lot of farmers who are interested in conservation already kind of have these natural areas, and maybe it's prairie strips are another way to think about putting them within agricultural fields. But I think if you have an interest in pollination or growing crops that rely on pollinators, there's a lot of different ways people have been thinking about how to put them in.
Okay. All right, I think that gets to most of our questions. As I said, this was a great way to start off the 2026 webinar series. Thank you all for attending. And again, if you need a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu. And Rachel, thank you so very much for your work and for your presentation today. It was really great. If you have more questions for Rachel, feel free to email her. I'm sure she'd be willing to answer those as she said she would be. So with that, thank you very much. Rachel, any last comments?
Thanks so much for having me.